This is the first episode of the DevDifferent podcast, brought to you by the team here at CodeBuddy. This is a new podcast where we're going to talk about everything software development related, all the new ways of tackling stuff, AI, everything that this world now has to offer. Before we jump in on what I think is going to be a couple really interesting topics around building your MVP and tax that non-technical founders have when starting a startup, I wanted to just do a quick roundtable and have each person here on the podcast introduce themselves. So, Devin, why don't you start us out?
My name is Devin Seacrest. I'm the CEO and co-founder of CodeBuddy. I've been doing software for over a decade. I've had several different startups. I've taught entrepreneurship at the university level. I've done work for federal law enforcement software, healthcare software, sales software, full stack engineer. I love the front end. Love talking about entrepreneurship. And yeah, just excited to be here.
Hunter Dorhout, CTO, co-founder here at CodeBuddy, also full stack engineer, prefer the back end. Met Devin several years ago at the working for wiretapping communications analysis software company. Made a couple stops in between there, did some work for the Air Force in the nuclear weapons space, generally in charge of making sure the bits and bytes get in the right places here at CodeBuddy. So.
My name's Ross. I'm part of leading the design team here at CodeBuddy. So I'm in charge of making things look good, making sure the experience is smooth. My background, I come from, like a couple decades now worth of design. I grew up with a pencil in my hand. My dad was an illustrator, so have always just kind of had that creative outlet and try to use my powers more for good now to be able to, just storytell around like what we're building, really just make sure that CodeBuddy is an experience that people want to come back for time and time again.
I'm Tanner Lytle. I'm the newest member of the CodeBuddy team. Been here 2 months almost to the day, which is quite exciting. My background, I come from the entrepreneurship world. Back in 2007, started my first company, which was perfect timing because 2008 happened and it was a great time to be in retail. But I did that for over a decade, then left that world, made an exit, and joined the IT space, both on the technical side as well as the sales and team building side, and decided that I cannot live in the corporate world. I am built for startups. So, really excited to be with you guys and help grow the company. And part of that, of course, is this podcast. So, let's get rolling on that. One thing that I really enjoy about our group, our panel here, is that we all approach everything from a different side. So you have Devin, the CEO side, Hunter, the CTO side, Ross on design, and me kind of a mesh everywhere in between, mostly just like, how the heck do we sell this thing and why do people care? So the first topic that I wanted to get into is challenges when building your MVP. So we were actually in a discussion yesterday talking about how many startups end up just wasting a considerable amount of time and money in building their first product. And by the time that they get it delivered, they've completely pivoted away from it and they use basically nothing of it. So, Devin, kick us off on kind of where your head's at on with that and a few stories and examples that you know of people kind of missing the mark on their first round.
Absolutely. So I've, taught at the university level for many, many years. All my friends have their own companies. 90% are in the software technology type field. I'm on my third concept too as well. But you see over and over again, just these companies that believe that, as soon as they get the idea, they need to like go out there and they need to spend hundreds and hundreds of $1,000s, building out that first concept so they can, get it in customers' hands right away. And what you end up seeing a lot of time is they'll, spend a lot of money, and in that process they'll also be validating the concepts, and they'll realize, well, oh, this is great, but there's actually this larger opportunity out here. Maybe we should go after that. And so you'll see all this money that was kind of, wasted in validating the concept versus, first validating and then going after. There was a mentor of mine that had this incredible quote of me, is like, find the cheapest, dirtiest, like fastest way you can test something out and do that first before you jump in and actually work on other stuff. So
I was talking with another founder the other day. I think part of the difficulty in building out MVPs is also part of the difficulty of like building software just in general, which is that like human brains are not really that well optimized to plan out a project that is not physical. So like it goes all the way back to like the origins of like agile software development, right? Prior to agile, you had waterfall, which was pretty much ripped directly from the construction industry. And like that is the main planning and execution framework that they use in the construction industry. And so early on, when we started building software as humans, we were like, let's do the same thing. So let's try to plan out the entire project, start to finish, and then go and execute it. And we learned pretty quickly that we're much, much better at planning out the steps of building a building than we are planning out the steps of building a piece of software. And it actually has to do with the structures that our brains have in understanding physical concepts, because it's much easier to understand that you can't put the electrical in a building before you have framed it out, or you shouldn't start with building the roof before you have walls. But then you flip over to software, and there are those equivalent kind of dependencies, but they're just not nearly as clear. So, like generally speaking, I think the whole idea of we're going to build a product and engage somebody to build it, and we know exactly what it is difficult to begin with, and then it's 10 times more difficult and 10 times more volatile when you're a startup, because like by definition, if you're pre-product market fit, that definition of like what you want to bring to market or what your customers want is changing almost daily, weekly. So it's a tough thing. It's definitely a learning process for sure.
Yeah, so in the industry, there's the term minimum viable product or MVP. And we kind of mentioned that before. What do you guys feel is actually an appropriate level to try to build to? I guess, Ross, I'll this to you first
Mhm.
because you're the guy who loves to make things pretty, very much like me. And sometimes we get caught into the way it looks rather than how it functions. But where do you feel like a good place to try to tackle an MVP is initially, and then how you can approach it after you have that built?
Piggybacking on what Hunter was saying about like the house or construction building analogy, I always think about, from a design perspective, you've got like the information architectural layer that is just kind of like what are the nuts and bolts of what we're trying to communicate as far as like the goal of the app or product. What and even extending that further into like the kind of design and marketing world, like what is the message, and then beyond that, like once you can kind of figure out the utility of that and sort of like essentially wireframing out the optimal sort of like flow, then I always think about like the making it pretty aspect of things is they should be working in parallel. I wouldn't say that, design should ever be an afterthought, but ultimately, like, that is like the coat of paint that you put on it at the end. Like, once you've kind of framed the house and you've got the walls up and everything's in there, you put the coat of paint on, you decorate, get some nice couch pillows or whatever for the living room. And those are the things that take things from, this fundamental thing that you've already established is really going to be useful, based on just kind of wireframing and exploring like that minimum experience. There's always room to kind of iterate and improve upon ultimately like the feel and like the overall like you know emotion that someone gets from interacting with that. So it is a bit of a blurry line, but I would say to answer the question, it's a little bit more of just like getting that structure and that function defined, almost regardless of what it looks like, and then kind of building that branded like emotional layer on top of it.
I love that analogy of it being the coats of paint, the pillows, all of the little extras. Because we were talking with the founder yesterday who had spent so much time on those elements, but had yet to even start building out the product. And I feel like that's oftentimes one of the big pitfalls when it comes to you have a great idea, but maybe you're a bit too scared to actually get started. So it's easy to kind of design out all the frills and, oh, yeah, I want to have this and I want to have what, that. But when it comes to actually building that framework, that structure you said, that's the hard part and that's the scary part, but that's probably where you need to start with. Devin, what's your point of view on like how to successfully start building your MVP, validating the idea, and find the most success in doing so?
I think it should be, MSP, or what's the minimum sellable product too as well. You don't need to build out the full house to detail to actually start selling it. If you think about it, like when you're filming a movie, they don't like build out the entire Hogwarts set. They build out, all right, in this scene, what is what are we going to need to see for this to actually work? And so you think about that, like who is our most valuable customer? Like, and what are they going to need to see and be able to do for them to actually want this product, and then like fake everything else. We call it Wizard of Ozing, or like everything else can still be running manually in the background until you have enough customers where you can say, all right, in order to scale, we need to build out some of this other stuff to support. But really, yeah, do is you know just get it to where like the basic customer experience and that sellable component looks really good and looks great, and do the rest manually.
What is the best approach to start building out that product? Because as you said, like doing it waterfall style just doesn't work because you're moving way too quickly. How do you get things pieced apart? Where do you start? How would you, if you were starting like from starting CodeBuddy, for example, or if you were to start a new venture
Mm.
today, how are you going to piece that apart and tackle it?
Yeah. So we run a framework called iDesign here at CodeBuddy. It's engineered or authored by a man named Yuval Lowy. And he has a saying, and he says, design iteratively, build incrementally, right? So you're always going to be iterating on the design of what you picture your product to be. But again, to go back to a physical thing, I've seen a graphic before, and it always drives me nuts when I see it. So it's like, this is agile development, and it's like you're building a car, and it starts with like a skateboard, and then it goes to a bike, and then it goes to like a motorcycle, and then a car. But if you spend more than like 2 seconds thinking about it, you're like, that's a horrible way to build a car. Like, building a skateboard does not in any way get you closer to building a car, right? And so that's where, Javal talks about building incrementally and not iteratively. Is, you have this vision for what you want to build for a car. Well, a skateboard's not going to do us any good, but a really bomb engine is a good start, right? So I think it's, it. I hesitate to give any one size fits all kind of recommendations because, frankly, I think especially in the world of development and how quickly it can go today, there's not a lot of wrong answers other than to be really nimble and to be not planning too far in advance.
So, what are some of the challenges that you guys faced when building your initial product of CodeBuddy? I know you guys have had quite a few pivots from the original concept and everything goes. Can you kind of explain that process and that story?
Our original concept was something completely different than what CodeBuddy even does as a service. But once we got into CodeBuddy, the goal was to figure out how do we, help developers and actually make an impactful difference on, getting software projects delivered faster, because even with generative AI, projects are 10 times more likely to go over budget and over time. And we're not talking about like a little bit over time and over budget. We're talking about like 200% over budget, and 70% over time. And these are projects that are $100,000 $1 million projects. So if you're going 200% over, you're talking about $100,000 $1 million mistake, and you're talking about 9 to 12 months past the deadline. I don't know any other industry that would accept that as a reality where you wouldn't get fired if that actually happened. But to jump back to your question, we got started as like a chatbot. We were, years before ChatGPT even like became on people's radars. Like, wow, this is a really powerful tool for software development. And we built out just kind of a basic feature component. We probably built out more than we even needed to, but the biggest thing is we got it in users' hands, and we said, hey, try this, use this, tell us what you think, like honest feedback, like no bullshit, like would you use this? And a lot of people were like, well, I'd probably just go Google first. And so those type of like honest critical like reactions from customers are really what you're like going after first. And like, how do you not spend, $100,000 $200,000 on a dev shop before you get that type of insight? And that's one of the things we're really trying to focus here too, is how do we, help companies, we call them applets, or these like really quick, prototypes, or MVPs about like the core concept that they're trying to build, get those built, and then get them tested, so you can have those like really quick aha moments without spending 100 $200,000 on them.
You mentioned that it's common that these things go over, 9 to 12 months, double the budget. How is that possible? Ross, like, where have you seen that before?
My past experience, I was an in-house kind of hybrid designer developer. And I was sort of this bridge between like the marketing team and the like IT team. In that sense, it was like a really unique position because I got to see both departments sort of operate and very differently, and lack of really resource planning, I guess, and having people at the ready to kind of like scale up when necessary. And it was this particular organization was a little bit more traditional in terms of just like staffing and stuff. So and budget. So it wasn't really like something that they were really super nimble and able to kind of add fuel to the appropriate I guess the way I like to think about it, it was like you'd have some of these areas of the organization that were like a Ferrari, and if they were given the proper fuel, they would go as fast as they possibly could. And then you had others that were just kind of like your minivan, that they were doing fine, but they were kind of like more of the, um, you know, they were more of the gas guzzlers, so to speak, I guess, if we can kind of extend this car analogy. Um, you've got some that are actually, if they're given the proper fuel, can go much farther and faster. Um, and those it's just like resource allocation, like I said, at the end of the day. And being able to have a resource that you can very quickly like say, oh, well, like we recognize that this vehicle here is actually has quite a lot of like runway in front of it, and there's a lot of potential and like for speed or mobility here to kind of like move the needle. Let's give that some extra gas. Ultimately, I think that's something that we're hoping to deliver here with CodeBuddy is being able to like regardless of the size, if you're on an enterprise level or if you're just like a small startup or a solopreneur, being able to just say like, this is my idea, let's prove this out, yes or no, um, and iterate and keep fueling from there.
One of the issues, Tanner, is there's also like a lack of standards, like uh, in the software industry, whereas everyone does things differently, and technology is constantly changing so fast that there's a ton of front end languages. There's a ton of back end languages. There's a ton of different cloud providers. There's a ton of different, databases that you can use, IDE tools that you can use. So any given task you can do with like literally a bajillion different combinations of tools. And so what happens is that every company, to do the same type of task, whether it's like log in or store something to a database, they have to start over and start from scratch. They can't go to the store and buy like an existing component that already plugs in with their system, because in the electrical world we have the same standards where it's 120 volt, like everything plugs into 100 volt. Imagine if every single like thing you went out to the store to buy had like a different voltage and wattage and plug in, and so everything you did, you had to go and you had to customize component to plug it into your house into. And that's the problem, is there's so much just reinventing of the wheel. Every single company that does something has to literally take a developer and start from scratch. And a lot of times that developer came from a different background too. They were working on a different language and technology stack, and they got hired to do this and work on a different language stack. So one of the things we've tried to do is like take those experts and help companies find someone that's already done that task that they've already done before. so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can find someone that's already done it exactly like they need to do it, so that they can go a lot quicker, because there's just so much waste, and that's what's causing projects to just like go massively. I've seen it in past, companies that I've worked for. I've seen it in companies that, I've run myself to as well.
The idea of a software project going over the budgeted time, it's it almost doesn't make sense depending on the scale of your time. It almost doesn't make sense to do projects on like software projects on like a multi-year basis, because again, it's just a waterfall approach to building software. And I think that's one of the other things too, is like, yes, there's benefit in long-term planning, but only insofar as like you actually know the information. And so I think a lot of these companies that are, going 9 months over on a 2-year project, part of it is they didn't leave themselves enough kind of wiggle room later in the project when they started, and they, kind of locked themselves into design decisions. Um, and I think that's part of too what CodeBuddy is really bringing to the market, is that idea of like, let's shrink down everything involved in software development and contracting and bringing in outside talent, because the smaller we make it, the less uncertainty there is, the smaller the cone of uncertainty. We're farther right on that axis, right? And we can estimate a whole lot better when we're going to get those things done.
Well, it takes a lot of hubris to believe that you can predict the future, right? So if
Mm-hmm.
you were a year and a half into a 3-year project and then ChatGPT drops, well, then
Mm-hmm.
are you staying on the road, or are you going to completely scrap that and go somewhere else? Or just even last week, or yeah, last week, Apple announced all their new features, which just completely changed the dynamics of how people are going to be utilizing their phone. So if you're not able to adapt quickly, and you believe like you already know what's going to happen a year from the road, and that's what you're building out, and you have all the stages done, you're by the time you actually finish it, you're going to be so far off the mark that you're not even in the same waters, right?
Devin, Devin is an economics major, right? You have an economics degree among many. And one of
Correct.
the things he taught me was the idea of last responsible moment decision making. So there's an idea in economics that you should wait as long as possible to make a decision until not making a decision would cause you material harm, because you are always acquiring more information the longer you wait, right? So to your point, Tanner, if you try to plan out, this is how everything is going to go, and then you don't account for a year and a half down the road, chat GPT comes out, or, who knows what the next thing is going to be, if it's large language models, or if someone's going to blow away vision or motion or something like that. And it's like, you should only plan enough stuff as so that your team isn't like running out of things, or you don't want to run into problems because of lack of planning, right? You need to have enough stuff for your team to be working ahead. And there's different, design is working a certain amount ahead of development, is working a certain amount ahead of QA. But it's kind of like backwards, where it's like we as humans want to plan everything just because uncertainty is uncomfortable. And so we try to plan as much as we think we can, but really we should almost flip it on its head and say we should plan as little as we think we can get away with, because we're always going to have more information 1 month from now than we do now, and we want to leave ourselves like the space to kind of take best advantage of that new information.
Yeah, and you got to be able to like tear everything down and rebuild quickly too. That's one of the things that Hunter's been really good at, is like if something new comes up, we gotta like you got to be able to, recreate what you've done, and you got to be able to go fast. It's these companies that are going to be able to move fastly on these new, uh, changes. We see a lot of our enterprise clients that have built these big, like mammoth softwares, and they are like really struggling to figure out, all right, how do we modernize this? And like they can't even adapt or use a lot of these new changes because their systems are so like old and coupled together for what they're doing.
I was just going to tip in with a couple thoughts. One, to kind of circle back to the previous question that you'd asked Tanner about where have I kind of seen some of these things running over budget. It was more often than not, in the case of that particular role that I was in, a factor of the code just being very, very old, and the code base itself being something that maybe was held on to a little longer than really necessary, and to the point where like the technology itself wasn't necessarily fully like supported, or there wasn't really like the development community around it to be able to like find resources when necessary. um, so I think that's a really interesting point around just kind of like trying to keep things current, and not really, I guess, speaking more down that path towards like nothing is precious, or nothing should be precious. Like there should be no sacred cows. There was this professor I had in art school like years ago that specifically made us like do a project. I think it was a painting class or something, but we spent what, 2-3 weeks, maybe more. We had to like build the canvas ourselves. We had to gesso it. We had to paint everything, obviously, like with whatever the particular subject matter was. And at the end, he had us throw it out, um, basically to prove the point that like you can spend all this time on something, but ultimately like you're going to need to be moving on to the next thing. Or like, the idea that like the most important canvas on your easel is the one that's there at the current moment. And once you're done, move on, iterate, keep going.
So, Hunter, you mentioned two things that kind of bring me to our next little discussion point that we wanted to hit on. One was we've talked with founders who are more design focused and they aren't technical. And then we see all these projects that are going over budget by 200% and are taking 9 months to a year longer. If you're a non-technical founder, you're not building things yourself. You're not iterating. You're not understanding what's under the hood. How is it feels like there is a tax today where certain firms or different types of situations, they want to sell you the whole package. That's what they're incentivized to do. They want to get as much from you because you're out raising money, you're getting grants, you're doing all these things. And so basically whatever you have available, they can consume and build you that package to do. How do you go about not getting kind of taken advantage of? How do you actually like retain control and build iteratively if you can't quite build yourself?
I'm just gonna send this one over to Devin because I think he's got an interesting perspective on this.
Yeah. I was in that position, 12, 13 years ago. I was a non-technical founder and, I wanted to get going. So we just threw hundreds of $1,000s at like a solution that we thought there was a problem. And we ended up like over years really understanding and discovering a new problem. But by then we had spent all our money. And so it was like, well, we can't really do much except, fold down this concept or start over. So the first thing I did is I became technical, and I'd highly recommend that. Of if you're going to do a software company, you have two options. You can either find a co-founder that is super technical and just rely on them, or you have to become technical, because even if you find someone else, there's a chance they could leave you. I've talked to, I know, like 5 buddies that have companies that each have gone through 3, 4, 5 different CTOs, and each time to them it is like getting divorced, and it's the most stressful thing. You feel like you're almost held hostage because you're building out this technical product and you're relying on someone else, and it almost creates a lot of tension between co-founders too, when there's someone non-technical that has these expectations and these frames of reference, and then you have a technical person which understands how it actually gets built and what you can do. So yeah, those would be my two things. And then there's there's kind of some other tools out there for how you can get help as a technical founder or a non-technical found boot camps, using tools like CodeBuddy too as well. But Hunter, what else you got on that?
Yeah, I think it's so backwards, but I agree with you that like you have to have somebody who is very much, we like to pretend that money doesn't make the world go around, but the reality is this is business, right? Everybody's in this to make money. You got to have someone with significant skin in the game that has technical skills that can make those evaluations of, the value added, even if you are using outside development, right? Just to have somebody highly technical with skin in the game that can make those determinations, because otherwise, it's like the mechanic, right? Honest mechanics are like, there's a reputation in the car repair world that, mechanics, especially, you get somebody who walks in who doesn't visibly look like they know about cars, then all of a sudden the prices go up. And the reason for that is because they know things that the customer doesn't know, and the customer knows that they don't know it, right? And so you can just, like I was talking the other day with somebody about a very well-known dev shop in our area, and found out that they spend 50% of their development hours writing unit tests, which, sounds great. It's great to have tested software. It's great to have things that run automatically and make green check marks. And like when you create a new build, it's awesome to know that stuff's going to work. But at the same time, what is the value of testing something if 2 months from now that code's not even going to be around because you're pivoting? You're doing the right stuff as a software startup. So I think, yeah, to Devin's point, I think having technical talent on the founding team is almost critical for if your product is software. There's kind of a distinction there too, right? If your product is a service that's enabled by software, could be a little bit different, perhaps. But then the other thing that I would say is build way smaller than you think, right? Like, so dev shops, it kind of blows my mind to hear. And it almost, when we were talking earlier about MVPs, like the idea of what is an MVP, I think means very different things to very different people. Because when I hear someone say like, we built an MVP with a dev shop for $200,000, like, you did not build an MVP. An MVP is something that, unless you're like, you would know if you were building an MVP that cost $200,000, if it was that highly technical and complex and you truly couldn't get to minimum viable for less than that, like, you wouldn't be going to a dev shop to do it. But like, when I hear MVP, and again, I'm a software developer and I chronically underestimate the amount of time and energy that things will take. I'm always like, oh, that's easy. But when I hear MVP, I'm thinking less than $10,000 at a reasonable rate of development time, quick and dirty, cut every possible corner that you can, because, you're probably going to throw it away, or you're probably going to change a lot about what it is. I was actually talking to a buddy the other day about he's building a kayak. So I do some like woodworking and kind of like crafting and stuff like that when I'm not on the keys. And I told him, he's a kind of a crafty guy, and I was like, you should do some stuff. And so he's like, okay, I'm building a kayak. And then we were talking the other day, and he was all concerned about like getting it right, like there's kind of some hard stuff that he's doing, whatever. And what I said is like, I always give myself give myself the space to build one version of a thing, like that's new to me, and like not beat myself up if it doesn't go correctly, because almost always the second one is really good. And like the value of the learning that you do in the first one, especially if you don't have someone there telling you, who's a master craftsman telling you this is exactly how you should do it. It's almost like, who are we to think that we can just cold knock it out the first time around and it's going to be the best, right? So build cheap, build fast, and then don't be afraid to build it again.
You mentioned on variable pricing. I read an article recently that talked about Uber. And so they changed the price on the same route for the same person depending on your battery level, because they factor that the lower your battery, the more desperate you're going to be. So the more that you're willing to pay for your ride. So it kind of
Whoa.
goes back to how can you position yourself where you're the one in charge and you don't have any desperation? Where does AI fit in all this?
It's a great question. And
Everywhere.
I don't know that anybody really knows. Yeah.
Where does it
I
fit in
mean,
what?
Where doesn't it?
in yeah, to get leverage, right? To not be vulnerable, to get information, to learn how to do stuff. It feels like we're now on this new frontier, right?
that was the other thing I was going to mention too, is like Devin said, like become technical, right? Devin, you did that in a time when becoming technical, especially about a specific, subject, was way more difficult than it is now.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you want to become technical on, graphs, node edge, graph theory, right? And like a couple of different tools that are out there to do it, and at least be able to speak to some developers about it. Like 3 years ago, 2 years ago, that's maybe some self-guided stuff, or maybe you go and take a class, like a $200 master class on something or whatever. Like the reality is today, go spend 15 minutes with ChatGPT and then, fact check some of the stuff that you're doing. And it's incredible, how quickly you can kind of upskill from a conceptual perspective. And then even from an MVP, like quick and dirty, running some stuff on your machine sort of perspective. Like if you're tenacious with ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, it doesn't matter, right? These highly competent large language models, it's pretty incredible what you can do with an hour and some tenacity.
Absolutely. I think the cool thing about ChatGPT is you ask it the questions, which is great because you can kind of figure out what you need to know. What you also need to do, though, is find an expert that's going to tell you the things that you don't know too as well. Like back when I was learning, it was just watching like, hundreds of hours of like developer like videos and stuff, listening to them like, all right, what would they have told me, or someone that's done this a million times, what did they actually learn when they do, and like what are those hacks, what are those best practices, because if you just ask ChatGPT, it's going to give you back what you asked, and it's not necessarily going to give you the best practices. It's going to like, here's how someone did it, here's the path to least resistance to get you where you want to get right away.
Well, I love it. I think this is a good cutoff point. We'll save more for next week's episode too. So the plan is we'll release this at least once a week. We're also going to be trying to invite different startups and developers and people that are in our network to join us to kind of talk about how they're building their software. And the ultimate goal is just to kind of show all of the new ways that every day this whole world is changing and how you can navigate it to build software, better software faster, I guess.
DevDifferent, baby.
Different, absolutely. With that, please make sure to subscribe to us, whether you're listening to this on an audio-based podcast or on YouTube. Follow us on any social media channels if you don't already, and share it with a friend. If you got something from it, share it with somebody, and hopefully they will too. And if you have any interest in learning about what we're doing here at CodeBuddy, you can visit us at codebuddy.com and sign up for a demo. Devin and I would love to show you the platform, show you its capabilities, and show you how you can ship software 5 times faster. Again, that's our whole mission, really, is to build better software faster. So that's the theme of the podcast. That's what we're doing at CodeBuddy, and we'd love to have you on board. So with that, we will see everybody next week. Bye-bye.